You know, sometimes the purest thing you ever do is the thing people understand the least. You give, and somebody calls it foolish. You forgive too quickly, they say you're being soft. You keep praying for something that looks dead and gone, and folks start looking at you like, bless your heart, when are you gonna move on? I don't know about you, but I've had people I love, look at me like I was taking this whole faith thing just a little too far. Isn't that a bit much? And it's not always loud. Most of the time it's not loud at all. It's a look, a raised eyebrow. Somebody just goes quiet on you, right when you're still believing, still showing up, still giving more than they think is reasonable. That's why I love Mark 14. Because it's not some far-off Bible story to me anymore. It's Tuesday afternoon. There's a woman, she walks into a room with something expensive. I mean, this is her savings, this is everything. And she breaks it open and she pours it out on Jesus. And before the perfume even settles in the air, somebody's already doing the math. What a waste. You know what that could have paid for? Couldn't she have done something more sensible? And here's what gets me. They weren't wrong on paper. That's what makes this story so uncomfortable, if we're honest. Nobody in that room was being cruel. They sounded reasonable. They sounded responsible. But Jesus saw something they completely missed. They saw waste. He saw worship. They looked at her and thought, too much. He looked at her and said, beautiful. So before we jump in with the room and start doing our own math on her, maybe we ought to slow down and ask ourselves something first. How many things in our own life have we called too much? Simply because we never bothered to understand the love that was behind it? Part 1. The room that measured everything. Before we get to the woman, and we will get to her, I want us to just sit in that room for a minute. Because this story isn't only about her. It's about what happens when love for Jesus gets expensive, visible, costly enough that people start doing math in their heads. Jesus is at Simon's house in Bethany. Simon the leper. Think about that name for a second. We'll come back to it. People are gathered around the table. These aren't strangers. Some of them have heard him teach. Some of them have watched him heal people nobody else would touch. They know he's not ordinary. And yet, when one act of devotion happens right in front of them, the first response isn't worship, it's arithmetic. How much was that worth? Couldn't that money have gone somewhere better? Was that really necessary? And here's the thing, those questions don't even sound wrong. They sound careful, responsible, the kind of thing a good steward would ask. That's what makes this story so uncomfortable to sit with. Because a lot of us know exactly what it feels like to have our devotion measured by somebody else's calculator. You keep praying for a son or a daughter who's still running. You're still praying about that? You choose obedience even when it costs you real money. That wasn't a smart move. You forgive again. You show up again. You stay soft when it would honestly be easier to get hard. And somebody looks at your life and thinks, quietly, that's a lot, that's just a lot. Sometimes it's not even the world doing this to us. Sometimes it's other believers, good people. They're not trying to be cruel, they're just being practical. But I've noticed something over the years. There's a kind of practical that little by little forgets how to recognize love when it sees it. We live in a world that wants everything to justify itself. Your time has to produce something. Your money has to return something. Even your worship, somehow it has to make sense on paper. But love for Jesus was never meant to pass an efficiency test. I think of the wife who takes care of her sick husband for years. No applause, nothing getting better, just faithfulness in a hard hallway nobody sees. I think of the parent still praying over an empty chair at the table. I think of the believer serving in some small corner of a church where nobody even knows their name. And the world looks at that and asks, why bother? Mark 14 is warning us to be careful here. The people in that room measured value by usefulness. Jesus measured the heart behind the offering. And that's where this story stops being about a woman 2,000 years ago and starts being about us. Because the danger isn't only that the world might misunderstand what we give to Jesus. The danger is that we can be sitting right next to him and still be using the wrong scale. Part 2. The woman who broke more than a jar. Now, let's look at her. Mark tells us she came in with an alabaster jar of expensive perfume, pure nard. And then he drops in one detail most of us read right past. She broke the jar. She didn't open it carefully. She didn't pour a little and save the rest for later, just in case. She broke it. And once that jar is broken, there's no putting the lid back on. There's no "I'll save some for next time." Sit with that for a second. Some love we can still manage. We can give a little and hold back a little. We can serve as long as it's convenient. We can obey right up to the edge of where it starts to cost us something real. We can even worship as long as it doesn't make anybody uncomfortable. But this woman crossed a line you can't uncross. That perfume wasn't hers to save anymore. It was gone, poured out, sitting in the air of that room. Whatever control she had over that gift, she gave it up the moment she broke the seal. And maybe that's exactly why the room got so tense. Because people generally aren't bothered by tidy religion. Careful faith doesn't offend anybody. What bothers people is love that's too open, too surrendered, too costly to explain in a sentence. We know this in regular life, don't we? A man can say he loves his family and still keep a piece of himself untouched, protected, off to the side. But when he starts rearranging his whole schedule, when he's the one sitting in the hospital chair, paying bills he didn't plan for, staying when it would be so much easier to leave, that's not a word anymore. That's something broken open. Same with faith. A person can talk about believing in Jesus for 30 years, but the day obedience starts costing real comfort, real pride, real plans, the version of life you had mapped out, that's the day faith stops being something you're holding in your hand. It's being poured out. That's what makes this moment so heavy. The beauty in that room wasn't really about the perfume. It never was. It was about the surrender. That broken jar was saying something words couldn't quite get to. Jesus, you're worth more to me than whatever I was saving this for. And I'll tell you, every one of us gets a moment like that. Maybe not with perfume, maybe not in front of anybody at all. Sometimes it's a decision nobody will ever know about. You forgive when bitterness would have been so much easier to hold on to. You tell the truth when a lie would have protected you. You give when keeping would have made a lot more sense on paper. You stay when walking away costs you nothing. And in that moment, something in you has to break. Not because God gets some kind of pleasure out of breaking people. He doesn't. But because real worship has a way of breaking the lie that we can belong to Jesus and still keep the rest of ourselves locked away, safe, untouched. She broke the jar. But I think what really broke that day was the idea that love could ever stay safe. Part 3. Why love always looks wasteful. Here's something I've learned after a lot of years of watching people love other people. Real love, almost every time, looks wasteful to somebody standing on the outside of it. If you've never sat by a hospital bed every single day for weeks, it's easy to ask why that person keeps showing up. If you've never carried a child in prayer for 10, 15 years, it's easy to say, maybe it's time you let that go. If Jesus has never met you in the lowest room of your life, and I mean the lowest, it's easy to wonder why somebody else would give him this much. That's just how love works. It has its own reasons. And half the time, those reasons don't translate to somebody who's only looking at the surface. From the outside, love can look like too many hours, too many tears, too much patience, too much money, too much mercy, way too much. But from the inside, it doesn't feel like math at all. It feels like gratitude. It feels like, after what he's done for me, how could I hand him only what's convenient? And I think that's exactly what that room in Mark 14 couldn't see. They saw something excessive. They had no idea what was underneath it. Now, let me say this too, because I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not saying every extreme thing is holy. We've got to be careful there. Some folks call their own impulsiveness faith. Some call their need for attention worship. I've seen people do something reckless and then wrap it in spiritual language. Well, I'm just giving it all to God. No, that's not what we're talking about here. This woman wasn't performing. She wasn't building herself a name. In that room, somehow, her heart saw one thing that everybody else was too busy calculating to see. Jesus was worthy. That was it. That was the whole equation for her. And when Jesus becomes worthy to you, really worthy, something shifts. You stop asking, what's the least I can give and still be safe? You start asking a completely different question. What's actually fitting for the one who loved me like this? That's not guilt talking. That's not religious pressure. That's just what gratitude does once it's had time to put down roots. Somebody who's been forgiven a great deal doesn't always worship quiet enough to keep the room comfortable. Somebody who's been carried through real grief might pray in a way that sounds intense to people who've never needed it that badly. Somebody who's been pulled out of shame might sing with their voice shaking, tears and all, and not care who's watching. Maybe that's where this story starts to search us a little, because the real question isn't whether this woman gave too much. The real question is whether our own love has gotten so careful, so managed, so respectable that we don't know what to do anymore when we see somebody pour theirs out. Sometimes what people call too much isn't too much at all. Sometimes it's just love that refuses to treat Jesus like he's ordinary. Part 4. Why the people close to Jesus still missed it. Now here's the part of the story that ought to make us go quiet for a second. The criticism in that room, it didn't come from Rome. It didn't come from soldiers. It didn't come from people who'd never heard Jesus say a word. Mark tells us some in that room got indignant, and Matthew tells us the disciples were right there in it. The disciples, the ones who'd walked with him, eaten with him, watched him heal a leper, calm a storm with his voice, forgive people the whole town had already given up on. Those men looked at an act of worship and called it waste. Let that sit for a second, because it means you can be close to holy things, really close, and still miss a holy moment when it's happening right in front of you. You can know your Bible inside and out and still misread love when you see it. You can sit in a pew for 30 years and still get uncomfortable when somebody else's devotion costs more than yours does. I say that gently, because this isn't only about them, is it? This gets close to home real fast. Here's the thing, the people who criticize deep devotion aren't always outsiders. Sometimes they know exactly how to sound spiritual. They've got the vocabulary down, balance, wisdom, stewardship, moderation, good words, every one of them. But good words can become a real nice hiding place for a cold heart. Somebody says, be wise. And what they mean is, please don't make me feel exposed. Somebody says, don't be so emotional. And what they mean is, your tears are making me uncomfortable. Somebody says, don't take it too far. And what they mean, whether they know it or not, is, your obedience is reminding me of where I quit obeying a long time ago. That's a hard thing to sit with, because her offering didn't just honor Jesus, it exposed the room. That's what real love does sometimes. It doesn't mean to, but it brings something hidden right up to the surface. You forgive freely, and it exposes how tight everybody else is holding their grudges. You give generously, and suddenly it's obvious how carefully the rest of us protect what's ours. I think that's why extravagant love makes people nervous. Not because it's wrong, most of the time it isn't. It's because, without saying a single word, it asks a question. Is Jesus really worth that much to you? And that question can unsettle a whole room real quick. So before we get too hard on the disciples, maybe we let this story turn around and look at us instead. Have you ever criticized somebody's devotion, not because it was wrong, but because it made your own love look a little too careful, a little too measured? Have you ever called something too much, simply because it was more than you were willing to give? Mark 14 isn't just the story of one woman's worship. It's a warning for everybody sitting close to Jesus, because being near him, That's not the same thing as actually seeing him. Part 5. Jesus defended what everyone else condemned, and then Jesus speaks. I want you to just feel the weight of that for a second. The woman doesn't say a word in her own defense. The room's already talking, judgment's already started rolling, and the words are sharp enough to leave a mark. Why this waste? This could have been sold. This money could have done some real good. And Jesus looks at them and says, "Leave her alone." You know, that might be one of the tenderest sentences in this whole story. Leave her alone. Not because every criticism in life is wrong. It's not. Sometimes we do need correcting. Not because every emotional act is automatically holy, but because in this one moment, that room had judged something they simply didn't understand. And Jesus knew it. He didn't let their voices become the last word over her worship. That matters to me. It matters a lot, actually, because some of you have been living way too long under the opinions of people who weren't even there. They weren't there when he carried you through that night you thought you wouldn't make it to morning. They weren't there when you were on your face praying, wet-faced, exhausted, holding on by a thread. They weren't there the time you almost walked out the door for good and grace somehow held you back. So now they look at your devotion and think, that's a bit much. But they don't know what he pulled you out of. They don't know what that worship cost you. They have no idea why your hands shake sometimes when you pray. Jesus knows. And in Mark 14, he doesn't just understand what this woman did, he steps in front of it. He stands between her offering and their accusation. I find that beautiful, honestly. Because there are things about your love for God you will never be able to explain in a way that satisfies everybody in the room. You could try, and they'd just come up with another question, another concern, one more reason you should have been quieter, safer, smaller. But notice, Jesus never put it to a vote. He named it himself. She has done a beautiful thing to me. Sit with that. They called it waste. He called it beautiful. They saw poor judgment. He saw a heart that was ready. And here's something else. Jesus even says her act was preparing him for burial before anybody else at that table was ready to even think about what was coming, which tells me her worship carried more weight than she probably understood herself in that moment. Sometimes your obedience runs deeper than your own understanding of it. Sometimes heaven understands what you're doing before the people around you ever will. So don't be too quick to shrink yourself down just because somebody nearby can't read what you're doing. Let Jesus have the final word here. Because if he calls it beautiful, the room doesn't get to rename it waste. Part 6. She never explained herself. There's one detail in this story that just gets heavier the longer you sit with it. She never explains herself. She doesn't stand up in the middle of that room and defend the cost. Doesn't argue with the ones who are angry. Doesn't say, you don't understand my heart. Doesn't try to prove a thing. She just gives. And then she lets Jesus talk. Now, that's not easy. Not for most of us anyway. Most people want to be understood. And the second we're misunderstood, something in us wants to jump up and fix it right then and there. Correct the rumor, answer the look, make sure nobody walks away thinking wrong about us. I get that. I really do. When somebody misreads your obedience, that stings. When your sacrifice gets called foolish, it can actually make you start second-guessing yourself. And when people treat your devotion like it's just emotional excess, you might feel like you need to pull out every scar, every hard story, just to justify why Jesus means this much to you. But this woman is teaching us something rare here. Not every sacred thing needs explaining to every critical person in the room. Some things are just between you and the Lord. There are prayers you prayed in a room nobody else saw. Nights you got through on nothing but the mercy of God, holding the pieces together. Reasons you worship the way you worship that you couldn't fit into a sentence after church even if you tried. Because the person asking wasn't there for the part of your story that made you this way. And that's all right. Now hear me, I'm not saying be stubborn. I'm not saying refuse correction,
Behold
because
the
a
two
humble believer
paths.
can still be taught,
One
still
leads
listen.
to humble
That's not what this
correction
is.
through the
But there's a
word,
real difference
the
between
other
receiving
to
correction
imprisonment
and
by
living
the
like a prisoner
judgments
to
of
everybody's
man.
opinion of you. This woman didn't let that room pull her attention off of Jesus. That's the quiet strength sitting right in the middle of this whole scene. She didn't make the critics the center of the moment. She didn't turn her worship into a courtroom. She didn't stop pouring herself out just because the man next to her didn't have the eyes to see what she was doing. Some of us need to relearn that, because criticism has a sneaky way of becoming a distraction. It'll pull your eyes right off Jesus and get you spending all your energy managing the room instead. But worship was never meant to answer to the room. So sometimes the most faithful thing you can do isn't argue louder or defend yourself better. It's not chasing down every person who got you wrong. Sometimes the most faithful thing is just keeping your heart down at his feet and trusting him to know the truth of it. She stayed silent, but that silence wasn't weakness, that was trust, plain and simple. Part 7. The fragrance outlived the criticism. The room criticized her, but the fragrance, it kept spreading. Picture that for a second. Long after those sharp words had already left people's mouths, that perfume was still hanging in the air. It got on the table. It got on people's clothes, even the ones who were upset about it. They could complain all they wanted, but they still had to sit there and breathe it in. That's how real devotion works sometimes, you know. People might not get it at first. They might talk about it all wrong. Reduce your whole life to one careless sentence. Too much. Too emotional, too costly, but give it time, something stays behind. Not the noise, the fragrance. A life poured out for Jesus leaves something behind that criticism just can't scrub out. A sharp word can fill up a room for an afternoon, but a faithful life, that's a different kind of weight altogether. It stays in the kids who watched you pray on your worst days. It stays in the people who saw you forgive when they were expecting you to get even. It stays in small churches nobody's ever heard of, quiet kitchens, hospital rooms, the lonely seasons where you kept choosing Christ and nobody clapped for it. At the time, folks might not even have a word for what you're doing, but years later, they remember. They remember you didn't quit easy. They remember you stayed tender when life handed you plenty of good reasons to go hard and bitter instead. And then Jesus says something that just about stops me every time I read it. Wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. Think about that for a second. The room wanted to file her act away as a mistake. Jesus tied it to the preaching of the gospel itself. They thought, poor judgment. He turned it into a memory that would travel to the ends of the earth, that ought to stop us in our tracks. Because Jesus doesn't remember things the way we do. We remember what was loud, what looked impressive, what made sense to us at the time. Jesus remembers love, and he remembers it exactly right. See, he already knew this act was tied to his burial. The disciples were still fighting the very idea that he was going to die. They wanted to talk about usefulness, about budgets. Meanwhile, there was sorrow and glory standing right there at the table, and they couldn't see it. She gave him beauty before the brutality came, before the soldiers, before the mocking, before the nails. She honored him while he was still there to receive it. And maybe that's part of what makes it so beautiful. Love didn't wait for the room to understand, didn't wait for the timing to feel safe. It just came while it still could. And that's a word for us too, isn't it? Don't wait till someone's gone to say what you actually feel. Don't wait for life to get convenient before you obey him. Don't wait around for everybody's permission before you pour out what belongs to Christ. The criticism in that room, long gone. Nobody remembers a single name of the ones who complained. The fragrance remained. 2,000 years later, we're still talking about her. Not because that room understood her, because Jesus did. Conclusion. Maybe there's a kind of love for Jesus that's never going to look reasonable to everybody in the room. And maybe that's all right, because the people around you don't always know what Jesus actually did for you. They know your face, your name, maybe a few pieces of your story. But they weren't there for the private mercy, the night you almost gave up and didn't. The shame he lifted off you when nobody else could even get close enough to try. So when they watch what you give him now, it might look like too much. Too much time, too much trust, too much of your life spent on somebody they can't even see. But love always looks a little strange to people who never knew the debt it came from. And honestly, I wonder how many of us have spent years trying to make our devotion smaller, easier for other people to swallow, lowering our voice, holding back the tears, explaining ourselves, softening what we actually believe. Not because Jesus ever asked us to shrink, but because somewhere along the way, somebody made us feel a little embarrassed for loving him this much. Mark 14 won't let us stay embarrassed, not if we're honest with it. There's a woman standing there with nothing left to take back. A room full of opinions, and Jesus, calm, clear, naming the moment exactly what it was. Beautiful. That's it. That one word was enough for him. Beautiful doesn't mean everybody understood it, doesn't mean it was safe or easy to explain to the person sitting next to you. It just means Jesus looked at the heart behind it and called it by its true name. So maybe the question isn't, will people ever understand my worship? They won't. Not all of them anyway. Maybe the better question is, has Jesus actually received what you've been too afraid to pour out? Because in the end, the room doesn't get the final word here. The critics don't get it. Even your own fear doesn't get it. Jesus does. And if he's the one calling something beautiful, you don't owe the rest of your life to apologizing for it. So let the room talk. Let the calculations run their course. Let the people who only know safe, tidy religion wonder why in the world you'd give this much. You know why. You know who found you. You know who forgave you. You know who stayed when everybody else could only see what was already broken in you. So bring him what you've been holding back, not to prove a thing, not to impress anybody watching, just because he's worthy. That's the whole reason. And one day, when all these loud opinions have faded out, when every careful little judgment has been long forgotten, what's going to be left isn't the noise from that room. It's going to be the fragrance of a life that decided Jesus was worth more than being understood.